"I've never been touched," I whispered, my voice trembling like the last leaf clinging to a branch in the wind, as I stepped into the marble lobby of the Caldwell Estate, each tile echoing my hesitant footsteps. The storm outside rattled the windows, raindrops streaking the glass in fractured patterns, casting shifting shadows across the polished floors. I clutched my tote bag tighter, feeling the weight of my ordinary life pressing against the opulence surrounding me. Henry Caldwell, the 65-year-old man who held a reputation that made headlines and whispers alike, emerged from the shadow of the grand staircase. His presence was immediate, magnetic, a silent command in the way he moved, his dark suit perfectly tailored, shoes clicking like measured punctuation on the silence. I froze as his eyes, sharp and discerning, swept over me, measuring, calculating. The air seemed to thicken, every breath deliberate, every heartbeat loud enough to betray my nerves. He stopped a few feet away, not too close to touch, yet close enough to feel the subtle warmth of his presence, the faint aroma of cologne layered with something indefinably commanding. I tried to speak, to explain why I was here, but words caught in my throat, the sudden gravity of the encounter rendering me small and exposed. Henry's gaze didn't waver, it held me, steady, unyielding, a force I couldn't look away from. I noticed the way the chandelier light gleamed off his silver hair, streaked through the black, and the subtle creases around his eyes that spoke of decades of command and experience. My mind raced, recalling the ordinary life I had left behind, yet every logical thought collided with the instinctive pull toward this man who seemed to occupy the air itself with authority. I shifted slightly, feeling my shoes slip on the smooth tile, and he inclined his head, acknowledging my movement as if noting each detail with deliberate precision. Then, without a word, he gestured toward the vast windows overlooking the estate's gardens, a silent invitation to step closer, a challenge embedded in politeness. I moved, compelled by curiosity, fear, and an inexplicable sense of destiny converging in the storms. Shadows. Each step brought me deeper into the rhythm of his control, the measured cadence of his presence dictating the pace of my own. My hand brushed against the railing as I ascended the staircase, my pulse quickening, ears attuned to the subtle creak beneath my weight. He followed, silent but present, the distance between us a carefully maintained tension. When I reached the landing, the panoramic view of the rain-slicked gardens unfolded, and Henry's voice, low and measured, finally broke the quiet. "You're here now, and you'll learn what it means to belong." My stomach nodded, a mixture of apprehension and an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing in my past could have prepared me for this encounter, and yet, inexplicably, I couldn't turn away. The hallways of the Caldwell Estate felt alive with the echoes of my footsteps as I followed Henry through corridors lined with grand paintings and sculptures that whispered of decades of wealth and influence. Each step I took seemed measured against the pulse of the estate itself, the polished floors reflecting the storm outside in fractured, silver streaks. Henry moved ahead, his presence an unspoken directive, the soft click of his shoes on the marble a rhythm I could not ignore. He paused at the entrance to the library, a room expansive enough to swallow me whole, walls lined with books whose spines gleamed like a treasury of knowledge and power. He gestured toward a chair by the window that overlooked the rain-drenched gardens, the water catching the light of the chandeliers above in a sparkling, shifting tapestry. I hesitated, caught between the instinct to retreat and the pull of something far larger than my understanding, the weight of his gaze anchoring me to the spot. When I finally took my seat, the leather cool beneath my palms, Henry settled across from me, the space between us charged with silent conversation. He spoke, his voice low, calm, deliberate, detailing the rules of his world without raising it, each word a subtle test, each pause a measured examination of my reactions. I listened, absorbing the gravity of what he was conveying, realizing that every gesture, every expression, every carefully chosen word was a demonstration of authority, and yet somewhere beneath the layers of power was a flicker of consideration, a recognition of my presence and agency within his sphere. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the vast windows in a steady rhythm that punctuated the weight of the conversation, making the world outside seem distant, almost unreal. My hands rested in my lap, trembling slightly, and I caught myself noting the small details of his office, the subtle scent of aged leather and wood polish, the precision of the arrangement on his desk, the faint glint of sunlight refracted through crystal ornaments. As he spoke about his expectations, I felt a strange interplay of fear and curiosity, a compelling invitation to understand, to engage, to navigate the unspoken rules he lived by. I realized that my ordinary concerns, my small, cautious life, seemed almost fragile here, suspended in the balance of his controlled world. Yet even as I absorbed the magnitude of his presence, I noticed the subtle ways he allowed me to occupy the space, the nuanced acknowledgement of my choices, the brief moments where his posture softened, just enough to hint that power and humanity could coexist. My heart quickened with each word, each measured glance, the tension building in the air between us, a tangible thread I could almost reach out and touch. The rain began to subside, leaving the scent of wet earth mingling with the subtle perfume of the estate's interiors, and I realized that I had been holding my breath, caught in the rhythm of his voice, in the cadence of his instructions, in the gravity of the unspoken claim he had already laid upon the space and, in some sense, upon me. Henry leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving mine, and I understood without words that this was only the beginning, that the storm outside and the storm within the estate were mirrored reflections of the delicate, powerful tension he held in every careful, deliberate gesture, and that my place here was not dictated by force but by the silent agreement that had already formed between us. The soft light of the estate filtered through the towering windows, painting the room in muted gold and silver tones as I followed Henry into the study, the air tinged with the subtle scent of old paper and polished wood. Each footstep echoed softly, and I felt the rhythm of the mansion around me, a pulse of history and authority that seemed to anticipate our every movement. He paused beside a massive desk, its surface meticulously organized, reflecting a mind disciplined and deliberate. The rain had eased outside, leaving a damp freshness that drifted through the slightly open window, carrying the faint fragrance of the gardens beyond. Henry gestured toward a chair, his hand steady, precise, and I took it, aware of the unspoken tension between obedience and curiosity. He settled across from me, his posture commanding but not overbearing, his eyes a steady gaze that seemed to measure both my apprehension and my courage. The conversation began quietly, his voice smooth and deliberate, explaining the intricacies of his world without ever raising it, each phrase a subtle lesson in control and the weight of responsibility. I listened, absorbing each word, recognizing the balance between expectation and allowance, realizing that every movement, every glance, every nuance of expression was a demonstration of authority tempered by discernment. Outside, the light shifted as the clouds passed, sending shifting patterns across the floor, and I noted the details of his surroundings, the worn leather of the chair, the subtle glint of sunlight on the polished surface of the desk, the way the shadows played across the bookshelves. Henry introduced me to the rules and rhythms of his daily life, the structure he maintained, the precision that guided his actions, and I felt both overwhelmed and strangely grounded, the contrast between his controlled environment and my ordinary existence stark and immediate. There was a moment, brief and fleeting, when he allowed a softening in his expression, a recognition of my presence, a silent acknowledgement that my choices and reactions mattered in this space, that my voice and actions, though tentative, were observed and considered. I felt a shift in the air, a tension not of fear alone but of anticipation, as if every thought and movement was part of an intricate pattern being revealed to me slowly, deliberately. The storm outside had left the world washed and quiet, and inside, the subtle movements of Henry, the careful cadence of his speech, and the measured placement of his gestures created a rhythm that pulled me further into his orbit. I realized that the ordinary life I had known could no longer contain the depth of this encounter, that the mansion, the rain-washed gardens, and the quiet power emanating from Henry formed a space that demanded attention, respect, and a willingness to engage. The conversation lingered, drawing me into a shared rhythm, and I felt the weight of unspoken understanding settling between us, a silent agreement that this encounter was a beginning, not an end, and that my presence here was not just permitted but acknowledged in every subtle gesture and deliberate glance, a quiet testament to the influence and measured possession he held in this refined, rain-kissed space. The evening light shifted through the tall windows of the Caldwell Estate, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the marble floors like quiet echoes of time. I followed Henry into the solarium, the scent of rain lingering from the gardens outside, mingling with the faint aroma of polished wood and delicate orchids that lined the room. The glass walls reflected the fading daylight, painting everything in a warm amber glow that contrasted with the cool, deliberate precision of his movements. He gestured toward a seating area by the sunlit plants, and I sank into the chair, my fingers brushing over the smooth leather as I tried to steady my racing thoughts. Henry remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, a study in controlled presence, the quiet authority he exuded pressing gently against the edges of my nerves. He spoke softly, not to scold or command, but to explain the structure of his world, the rhythm and rules that governed life in his estate, and how understanding them was not a suggestion but a necessity. As he outlined expectations, I noticed the careful way he observed my reactions, the subtle tilts of his head, the minimal shifts in posture that signaled his awareness of every nuance, every flicker of emotion across my face. I felt the tension of being both observed and acknowledged, a strange combination of weight and safety, a paradox I could not reconcile yet felt compelled to understand. Outside, the storm had cleared, leaving the gardens wet and glistening, droplets clinging to petals and leaves, each one catching the light like tiny prisms, a silent testament to the world beyond the walls. Henry paused, his gaze steady, and gestured to the glass ceiling above us, noting the changing light as though it were part of a lesson. My thoughts raced, balancing fear with fascination, curiosity with caution, as I realized that this space, so carefully curated and controlled, was a mirror of the man himself, precise, commanding, yet holding within it a depth I had yet to fully grasp. He moved toward the window, looking out at the gardens with the calm deliberation of someone who had shaped everything around him to reflect order and purpose. I watched him, noting the quiet strength in his stance, the measured way he breathed, the subtle attention to detail that marked every choice he made. The room seemed suspended in this delicate tension, each moment stretching into the next, a dance of observation, understanding, and unspoken connection. As he turned back to me, his expression softened just slightly, a flicker that suggested acknowledgement of my presence beyond mere compliance, recognition that my thoughts and choices mattered within this carefully constructed world. I felt a shift within myself, a mixture of anticipation and tentative trust, a sense that my ordinary life had been set aside, replaced by the intricate rhythm and measured authority that Henry wielded effortlessly, and that my role in this unfolding space was becoming both defined and inextricably linked to the cadence of his presence. Henry led me through a narrow hallway lined with dark oak panels, the subtle scent of polished wood mixing with the faint aroma of rain lingering from the gardens outside. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the gleaming floor, casting a pattern of gold and amber across the walls, and I felt the rhythm of the house echoing in my chest, each step measured, deliberate, in tandem with the quiet authority he exuded. He paused at a set of French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the estate, the clouds breaking to reveal streaks of orange and pink from the setting sun, the air carrying the crisp freshness of the storm that had passed. I stepped forward, my hands brushing the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingertips, and he followed, a silent presence that somehow expanded the space around us without intrusion. The wind stirred gently, teasing the edges of my hair, and Henry turned slightly to observe me, his eyes steady and discerning, taking in my reactions with quiet precision. He spoke then, his voice calm and deliberate, explaining the balance between freedom and expectation within his world, the subtle interplay of trust and responsibility, and I listened, absorbing the cadence of his speech, the careful choice of words, the way each phrase was weighted with intent and measured authority. I noted the small details around us, the latticework of the balcony, the way the light shimmered on the wet leaves below, the faint reflection of the sky in the glass doors, and felt the rhythm of observation, the awareness that every movement, every glance, was acknowledged and recorded. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to guide, to create a framework within which I could begin to understand the scope of the life I had stepped into, and I found myself responding, tentatively at first, then with a growing awareness of the subtle power dynamics at play. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows, and I realized that the ordinary world I had known seemed distant and unreal, replaced by the deliberate order and quiet command that Henry maintained effortlessly. Each moment was a negotiation of attention and presence, and I became aware of how much space I occupied, how my choices and responses were being registered, shaping an understanding between us that required no explicit consent, only observation and acknowledgement. As the sky darkened to a soft indigo, Henry gestured toward the interior once more, inviting me back into the warmth of the estate, and I walked alongside him, feeling the measured cadence of his presence guiding each step, a silent reassurance that within this carefully structured world, I was both observed and considered, my place defined not by force but by the recognition of my participation in the rhythm and authority he maintained so effortlessly. The evening deepened, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting long shadows across the grand hallway as Henry guided me toward the drawing room, each step resonating against the polished hardwood, a subtle reminder of the deliberate order and authority within these walls. The room opened into a spacious area, lined with tall windows that framed the gardens outside, where the remnants of the storm glistened under the last light of dusk, each leaf reflecting a faint shimmer like a whisper of the world beyond the estate. I sank into a plush armchair near the center of the room, the fabric cool beneath my hands, and Henry took a position nearby, his presence steady, quiet, commanding without intrusion. He began to speak in measured tones, his voice filling the space with clarity, describing the expectations, the routines, and the subtle nuances that shaped life within the estate, emphasizing not just obedience but understanding, the balance between guidance and trust. I listened, absorbing each word, noting the precision with which he conveyed meaning, the slight inflections, the pauses that drew attention to particular details, and the way his gaze, unwavering, seemed to track my every reaction, registering thought and feeling with quiet intensity. The scent of polished wood mixed with faint hints of rain carried through the open windows, grounding me in the reality of the moment even as the elegance of the surroundings made it seem almost surreal. I noticed the subtle elements of his presence, the way his posture remained controlled yet relaxed, the minimal shifts in expression that hinted at careful observation, the gentle acknowledgement in the tilt of his head as if to recognize the small victories of comprehension and attention. My heart raced with anticipation, each word he spoke layering understanding and connection, the rhythm of his speech guiding the pace of my thoughts, compelling me to follow not out of fear but from a growing recognition of the structure and care embedded in his world. Outside, the gardens glistened with lingering raindrops, the soft sounds of wind stirring leaves, and I felt the contrast between the chaos of the storm past and the deliberate tranquility of the estate, a reflection of the meticulous control Henry maintained over the space and, by extension, over the interaction we shared. He invited me to walk with him to the center of the room, each step deliberate, each movement calculated yet graceful, and I realized that the subtle choreography of his presence created a sense of inclusion, a way of making me a participant in the rhythm and structure he upheld. The room seemed alive with the quiet authority of his being, the air charged with observation, reflection, and the unspoken acknowledgement that my engagement mattered, and in that understanding, I found a tentative comfort, a recognition that my place within this carefully orchestrated environment was being both guided and validated, the delicate interplay of presence, expectation, and awareness drawing me further into the orbit of the life Henry so precisely shaped. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, leaving a twilight glow that filtered through the tall windows of the Caldwell Estate, casting long, muted shadows across the expansive drawing room as I followed Henry into the center of the space, my footsteps tentative yet compelled by the unspoken rhythm he maintained. The polished hardwood reflected the soft light, creating a path that seemed to guide me forward, and the subtle scent of rain still clinging to the garden beyond mingled with the faint aroma of aged wood and the delicate fragrance of the orchids in the corners of the room. Henry moved with deliberate grace, his posture a study in controlled power, the quiet authority of his presence filling the space without a single word, yet demanding attention in the most natural, unforced way. He paused, observing me, noting the subtle shifts in my expression and the way my body responded to the grandeur and order of his surroundings, each glance a precise calibration of perception and understanding. As he spoke, his voice low and measured, I absorbed the cadence, the deliberate pace, the way every word seemed chosen to convey meaning without command, yet imbued with the gravity of experience and expectation. He outlined a scenario, a choice that required discernment and reflection, and I felt the weight of his words pressing gently against my awareness, compelling me to consider the implications and navigate the expectations embedded within them. The room seemed to respond to his presence, every detail, the shimmer of light on polished surfaces, the soft hum of the estate's heating, the gentle rustle of leaves beyond the windows, intertwining with the deliberate flow of his guidance, creating a space where observation, reflection, and engagement converged. I found myself leaning into the rhythm, attuned to the subtle interplay of his authority and the acknowledgement of my presence, recognizing the careful balance between freedom and expectation that he orchestrated with quiet precision. The twilight outside deepened, softening the contours of the gardens and casting the interior in warm, diffused tones, and I realized that every gesture, every pause, every nuanced expression of his had been designed to draw me into understanding, to make me aware of my own position within this carefully maintained environment. Henry's gaze softened slightly, a fleeting acknowledgement that my attentiveness and thoughtful responses were recognized and valued, a subtle signal that while the structure of his world remained firm, there was space for observation, consideration, and gradual comprehension. I felt a tentative sense of inclusion within the deliberate orchestration of his presence, the interplay of guidance and recognition creating a quiet, compelling tension that held my attention, shaped my awareness, and invited me to engage with the unspoken patterns and the rhythm of authority that defined life within the Caldwell Estate, a space that was at once imposing and remarkably alive with the careful cadence of his influence. The room had grown quiet, the soft hum of the estate settling around us like a living presence. And I felt the gravity of the evening pressing gently but insistently against my awareness. Henry remained standing near the windows, the fading light outlining his strong, deliberate posture, every movement measured, each glance purposeful. The air was cool, carrying the subtle scent of wet earth from the gardens and the lingering fragrance of the polished wood and orchids within the room, and I realized that the quiet was not empty but charged, a space waiting to be filled with understanding, attention, and observation. He spoke, his voice calm yet deliberate, describing the responsibilities, the subtleties, and the intricacies of navigating the estate, the way he expected consideration and attentiveness in every interaction, the careful balance between autonomy and guidance. I listened, absorbing the rhythm of his speech, the deliberate pacing, the weight of each carefully chosen word, noticing the subtleties in his posture, the precise tilt of his head, the quiet acknowledgement that I was following, learning, and adjusting within the space he had so meticulously orchestrated. Outside, the twilight deepened, the gardens appearing as a soft, darkened canvas, droplets glistening faintly in the dim light, the contrast between the stillness of the estate and the world beyond creating a sense of suspension, a moment poised between expectation and realization. I felt my pulse quicken with awareness, not of fear but of recognition, that each step, each response, each tentative gesture I made was registered and considered, forming an unspoken dialogue, a silent collaboration between my perception and his guidance. Henry gestured toward the central seating area once more, indicating without command the space I should occupy, a subtle orchestration that spoke volumes about the control and care embedded in his actions. I moved, following the silent rhythm of his direction, aware that every nuance of attention, every micro-expression, was part of a larger understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that my presence and reactions were meaningful within the careful structure he maintained. The soft light caught the edge of his suit, the silver threads in his hair, and the intensity in his eyes, a combination of focus and deliberate consideration that drew my attention fully into the present moment, making the space around us feel both vast and intimately connected. As he spoke further, outlining the subtleties of observation, responsiveness, and engagement, I realized that the environment, the measured cadence of his voice, and the deliberate arrangement of the room were designed to create a sense of clarity and comprehension, teaching awareness through presence and interaction. The faint sounds from the gardens outside, the subtle shift of shadows as the evening progressed, and the measured tone of his words combined to form a rhythm I could follow, a flow that made each choice, each glance, each understanding a part of a larger, intricate pattern, and I felt, for the first time, that I was not just observing but participating, that the quiet, deliberate authority surrounding me was shaping a space where learning, recognition, and engagement were inseparable from the presence and guidance Henry provided, leaving me aware, attentive, and profoundly connected to the rhythm of the estate and to the subtle, compelling gravity of his influence. The night had settled fully over the Caldwell Estate, the last traces of sunset fading into a deep, rich indigo that enveloped the gardens and terraces outside, leaving only the soft glow of interior lights to illuminate the grand spaces within. I followed Henry into the central hall, my footsteps measured, careful, as though the weight of each movement mattered more than it ever had in my ordinary life. The polished marble reflected the subtle golden light, creating a sense of depth and presence, and the faint scent of rain still lingered, mingling with the warm aroma of the estate's wood and floral accents. Henry moved ahead with deliberate grace, each step calculated yet effortless, the quiet authority of his presence commanding attention without force. He gestured toward a large settee near the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds, and I took my place there, my hands resting on the smooth fabric as I felt the gravity of the space around me. His voice, calm and measured, filled the room, speaking of responsibility, awareness, and the subtle dynamics of observation and interaction that governed the rhythm of life within the estate. I listened intently, absorbing each word, noting the slight shifts in his expression, the careful consideration in his posture, and the way his eyes, steady and discerning, seemed to track every flicker of emotion on my face. Outside, the gardens shimmered under the moonlight, droplets from the earlier storm catching the faint glow of the lamps and creating a delicate sparkle, a quiet reminder of the world beyond the walls and the contrast between natural chaos and the deliberate order Henry maintained. I felt my awareness heighten, every thought, glance, and movement becoming part of a larger understanding, an intricate dance of attention and recognition between us. Henry paused, his gaze softening ever so slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that my presence, my attentiveness, and my reflections mattered within the structure he upheld, creating a connection built not on coercion but on shared understanding and the measured cadence of presence. The room seemed to breathe with us, the quiet hum of the estate, the faint creaks of floorboards, and the gentle whisper of the wind outside composing a rhythm that guided my perception and response, drawing me further into awareness, reflection, and engagement. I realized that my ordinary world, the routines and boundaries I had known, had been replaced by a new context, one defined by observation, subtle influence, and deliberate authority, where each action and reaction carried weight and significance. Henry moved closer, maintaining his measured composure, and gestured toward the balcony once more, inviting me to look out over the moonlit gardens, to absorb the stillness and the meticulous order of his surroundings, and I understood that in this quiet, carefully curated space, my place had been established, recognized, and acknowledged, a connection forged through attention, respect, and the silent, compelling gravity of his presence that would guide the rhythm of our unfolding interaction. From this moment forward,